As the 20th century began, the Austrian Empire was beginning to show the signs of crumble under the strain of nationalism. An aging Franz Joseph still presided over Austria, and because of the suicide of his son, the Crown Prince, he was now forced to place his hopes in his nephew and heir, Franz Ferdinand, whom you see in the photo. The emperor did not care much for his nephew, who represented something of a liberalizing influence in Austria, and he especially did not like his wife Sophie, to the point that their marriage was made a morganatic marriage, that is, their children would not be heirs to the throne. However, the Archduke did have an ally, and that was the Kaiser of Germany, who regarded Franz Ferdinand as a protege and became close friends with Franz Ferdinand over time. On January the 22nd, 1901, the Queen died after a reign of 63 years. Her son and successor, King Edward VII, and her eldest grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm, were at her deathbed. It was a national day of mourning. The Queen had regained her popularity after Disraeli had coaxed her out of retirement, and she was seen as the grandmother of all Europe instead of just the grandmother of the European peoples. She was well loved and sorely missed by the time she left the stage. And now Bertie ascended to the throne and became King Edward VII. He almost died before his coronation, suffering a ruptured appendix that required emergency surgery. But he survived and began his 8.5-year rule that was short but glorious. He returned the British monarchy to a sense of great pageantry. Victoria had become the little queen who wore black and was rarely seen with the public. Bertie, on the other hand, wore great uniforms, had pageantry. He associated the royal family more and more with the British people. He was a very good political king who was known as being a peacemaker. He helped foster the good relations between Britain and France. He initiated the beginning of the Edwardian era, putting an end to the Victorian era. Significant changes in technology and society, the steam turbine. You also see the political rise of socialism. And he also restricted the power of the nobility by bringing the House of Lords to heel and essentially taking away their veto power. He approved of all of this. Here you see a photograph of 4 kings. On the right is King Edward VII. His son, George, the Prince of Wales, the former Duke of York, is on the left. Between them are 2 young princes. Edward in the back would become King Edward VIII. They nicknamed him David. The young boy standing in the front is Albert George. He is the future King George VI, and he is the father of the current Queen, Elizabeth II. Edward VII only reigned 8.5 years, from 1901 to 1910. Since Victoria was the grandmother of all Europe, Edward was considered to be the uncle of all Europe because many of the crowned heads of Europe were his nephews. His reign, like I said, marked the return of the glorious monarch. He elevated the royalty to a more pageantry, more pomp and ceremony than the dowdy little queen had. He also managed to maintain order in Europe through backdoor diplomacy. Backdoor diplomacy means that you could go and approach the nephews who were your European leaders and impress on them the need to maintain peaceful relations or to work out better treaties. Of course, the one nephew that Bertie always had trouble with was his oldest nephew, the Kaiser. The 2 men didn't like each other that much. They tried to work together at times. Bertie's efforts at bringing a peace with Germany in the center really came for naught in the end. He died in 1910, and it was one of the most spectacular funerals in all of England. Unlike Victoria, who had a very private ceremony at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, The funeral of Edward VII was a magnificent affair, the likes of which you see for, like, for instance, presidential funerals, like the Kennedy funeral in 1963, the Reagan funeral back in 2013. Anytime a president dies or a ruler dies, you have a big ceremony. It was an incredible assembly of monarchs led by the heir to Edward, now King George V of England, followed by his cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm. Wilhelm was only 6 years older than George, but he always referred to him as my boy in sort of a patronizing way. King Alfonso XIII of Spain, Manuel II of Portugal, Ferdinand of Bulgaria, King Constantine of Greece, Frederick VIII of Denmark, Haakon VII of Norway, King Albert of Belgium. You had Prince Michael Alexandrovich of Russia was representing the Tsar, and you had 30 other noteworthy princes and dukes. It was indeed the last great assembly of monarchs ever assembled in all of Europe. You would never see this like again. Here you see the great parade carrying the casket of King Edward through the streets of London, where more than 1 million people line the streets to pay their respects to their beloved king. This is a photograph of the 9 sovereigns gathered at Windsor Castle for the funeral of Edward VII. This was taken on May the 20th, 1910. Standing from left to right, Haakon VII of Norway, Ferdinand of Bulgaria, Manuel of Portugal. In the center, Kaiser Wilhelm. To his right, George of Greece, and to the far right, Albert of the Belgians. Seated from left to right is Alfonso XIII of Spain. In the center seated is King George V of the United Kingdom. And finally, on the far right seated is Frederick VIII of Denmark. The 9 kings. What the backdoor diplomacy of King Edward failed to counter was the growing situation of these alliances and secret treaties that were being signed. Some of these treaties were secret, others were very public. In 1904, Britain and France put aside their ancient quarrels. They had had one last set to, so to speak, in Africa called the Fashoda Crisis, in which the British Empire and the French Empire locked horns. But after this, with the help of Bertie, King Edward, in 1904, Britain and France signed the Entente Cordiale, in which Britain and France would no longer just be allies, it would be friends. Now the German states forge an alliance. It's called the Triple Alliance. This was back in 1882. Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Italy all forged this Triple Alliance, and they would later be called the Central Powers because they occupied the center of Europe. In 1907, Britain, France, and Russia signed what was known as the Triple Entente. They would become known later as the Allied Powers. Now, here's the problem. In 1908, Austria annexed Bosnia. Bosnia has many Slavic people living in it. You have Bosnian Serbs, you have Bosnian Muslims, you have Bosnian Catholics. Very few Austrians in there, but Austria took Bosnia. This caused a great deal of tension among the Bosnian Serbs as well as the Serbs living in the country of Serbia. When Austria did this, Russia, which had been separating from Austria since the Crimean War, felt very undermined by Austria, and Russia felt themselves to be the big brothers to all the Slavs down in the Balkans. So there were a series of little Balkan wars in 1912 and 1913 involving Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, Montenegro, Romania, and Albania. The Serbs wanted to annex Albania. Austria moved in and prevented this. This caused more anger between the Austrians and the Serbs. While all that is going on, the powder is being fused at this point. You're putting the primer in and lighting the fuse. These nations were starting to devote a great deal of their capital and a great deal of their concentration into the buildup of armies. We're not talking about a couple of thousand or tens of thousands of men. We're talking about hundreds of thousands and millions of men. And all of them would have what's called a domino effect of mobilization. Mobilization meant that once the order was given, soldiers, civilians would report to their stations, exchange their civilian clothing for uniforms, get on the train, and start heading toward the border. The problem with mobilization is that there was no off switch. Nobody even considered saying, well, we're not going to go to war today, so let's pull everybody back. And you can see the problem that is inherent there. So the Triple Alliance started out with Germany, Austria, and Italy. But Italy is going to switch sides during the First World War, and Germany and Austria will replace Italy with the Ottoman Empire. Italy will then join the Triple Entente. Now, Italy was in these alliances for one reason and one reason only. They wanted to solidify their national identity. They wanted to get some territory that they felt belonged to them from the Austrians. So this map shows the two alliances at the outset of the First World War. In blue are the nations of the Triple Entente, the Allied, Britain, France, Russia, the French possessions in North Africa. In the gold areas, you see Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. And they're called the Central Powers for exactly that reason. They are in the center of Europe. Of course, there is one nation that is always neutral, and that's the Swiss. Notice, if you will, the amount of expenditures that the nations of the various treaties expended on their military. Look at how Germany increased its spending exponentially by the outset of the First World War. But the other nations spent a great number of millions of pounds or millions of dollars on their militaries. The center of Serb, Croat, and Muslim tension was Bosnia-Herzegovina. Like I said, it had been annexed by Austria in 1908, much to the chagrin of the Serb population there, who believed and wanted to be part of Serbia, as well as the government of Serbia that wanted them. As such, both the Serbs in Bosnia and the government of Serbia sponsored numerous activities to undermine the Austrian Empire. This included violence and assassination. The climax of this came on June the 28th, 1914. The Archduke and heir to the throne of Austria, Franz Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie visited Sarajevo. They visited the city council. In the morning, on their way to visit the city council, somebody had thrown a bomb at the motorcade, but the bomb exploded in the back car, not the Archduke's car. And so this was a foiled assassination attempt. After they visited the city council, the driver of the Archduke's automobile was ordered by the Archduke to turn around and go to the hospital to see and visit with the victims of the bombing from earlier that day. When he discovered that he needed to do this, he tried to pull into an alley and then back out and go the other way. The car stalled. At that point, sitting in a cafe across the street was a young Serbian national named Gavrilo Princip. Princip was despondent because the early assassination attempt had failed. He had not been part of that, but he had approved of it. Princip, who was only 18 years old, immediately saw his chance, pulled out a small pistol, leapt onto the car, shot Sophie in the stomach and the Archduke in the neck, and both died on their way to the hospital. The Austrian government and the Austrian royal family could not stand either the Archduke or Sophie, and gave them a funeral in which Sophie's coffin was actually lower than the Archduke's. This is how much contempt and how inane the Austrian court had become. Nonetheless, when you kill the heir to the throne, you are committing a major crime. And so the Austrian government immediately deduced that Princip was working with blessing from the Serbian Black Hand, and demanded insulting and oppressive concessions from Serbia, such as allowing Austrians to come into the police agencies and take over the investigation, and that the Serbians would have to surrender some territory. The Serbians agreed to almost every demand. But the Austrians had turned to their preeminent German neighbor, and they asked for support in what was to come. The Kaiser and the German government effectively issued a blank check to Austria. You can do whatever you want. So despite the Serbian concessions and an attempt by the British to mediate the dispute which the Germans undermined, the Austrians declared war on Serbia a month later on July the 28th, and now the dominoes began to fall. War fever broke out in the presses of Austria, Germany, and Russia. The Austrians now set forth their mobilization. The Russians immediately responded and began to mobilize. This prompted an exchange between the two cousins, the Kaiser of Germany and the Tsar of Russia, in what was known as the Willy-Nicky correspondence. The problem was that war mobilization could not be stopped once it began. When that happened, there was nothing a civilian leader could do to pull back. This shows you how the militaries had effectively taken over the war powers of their own governments. The picture on the left is that of Gavrilo Princip. On the right is the automobile that carried Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie when Princip assassinated them. At his trial, the 19-year-old Princip stated, "I am a Yugoslav nationalist, that is, a Southern Slav, aiming for the unification of all Yugoslavs, and I do not care what form of state, but it must be freed from Austria." Princip was sentenced to 20 years in prison, the maximum for his age, and was imprisoned at the Terezin fortress. He died on April 28, 1918, from tuberculosis that was exacerbated by poor prison conditions, which had already caused the loss of his right arm. Princip is hailed as a hero in Serbia to this day. There are schools and streets named after him. Despite the frantic attempts of the Kaiser to get the Russians to back down, the Russians continued with their mobilization toward Austria. So the Germans began mobilization in early August. Now the Russians were bound by treaty with the French, who had pledged to come to their aid if attacked. This is part of the Triple Entente. Knowing this full well, the German government, in a typical manner, demanded that the French not mobilize, lest it also be invaded. The Germans then demanded that the French pledge their neutrality by handing over a number of frontier forts. Now, the French were not about to be dictated to by the Germans, so they refused and began to mobilize. Now, in order to attack France, the German High Command decided several decades earlier that the best way for them to attack France was to use Belgium. So Germany now turns to King Albert of Belgium and demands that the Belgians allow the Germans free passage, just to walk right through Belgium on their way to France. And Albert, the king of the Belgians, responded, "I rule a country, not a highway." When Belgium was created in 1839, formerly the Austrian Netherlands, Great Britain pledged by treaty to protect the neutrality of Belgium. British Prime Minister Herbert Asquith renewed that pledge and prepared to send a British army to the continent to protect the Belgians. This prompted German Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg to plead for the British to stay out, asking the departing British ambassador Edward Goschen, "You're going to war over a scrap of paper?" Now, most Europeans greeted the news of this war with joy and parades. Many on both sides predicted a quick victory. Armies marched through the streets with people cheering them on. Everybody was predicting, "We'll be home by Christmas." But on August 3rd, 1914, Sir Edward Grey made his famous quote, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime."